Well done for the way this conference has gone this week. I've been in other places, haven't been here, but the reporting of it has been really positive, and the messages coming out feel like the right messages of the right moment, and looking forward to what we need to do differently in the future. So congratulations to everyone who's been involved in achieving that over the last few days. Thank you for those who are joining us. It's a bit of an early start, and I'm amazed that you've now filled the room up at 8:50, bearing in mind how late I know some of you were working last night. I arrived at about midnight, and I could hear the hubbub of work going on around the place. I want to say a particular thank you to Gavin and Irene for their work in helping to develop your professional body, the College of Policing, over the last few years. And in Irene's case, she goes right back to when it was being thought about, proposed and designed. So as a board member, when she asked me very challenging questions, which she was very good at, I did sometimes remind her that she designed the organisation herself previously. Gavin now sits on the board at the college, and Paul now is on the professional committee, and I have to say they are extremely active, engaged and challenging members of those important parts of your professional body. And I think I've heard Gavin say that the professional committee is a place where perhaps refreshingly every voice from every part of policing is genuinely heard at the table, and there is a fair and honest debate about the big issues that are coming along. Gavin often talks about looking into the future and being better at horizon scanning and throwing our vision out a bit further than the next 18 months. And I think he's right to have pushed on that agenda for a long time. I wasn't here, but Paul Griffiths a couple of days ago, I know, looked into the future and produced a picture of me in ermine, having been ennobled in the House of Lords. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful that in the picture I appear not to age over the next 20 to 30 years, which is quite refreshing. I was with my eldest son at the time when you did that, and he saw it on Twitter. By the way, I'm very proud that he's a patrolling uniform constable, or a bobby on the beat, as it's sometimes called. And I have checked, and he has been seen by lots of people in the last 12 months, which is good news. So he looked at the picture of me as a lord, and he said, since they've done away with hereditary peerages, it would be pointless me now becoming a lord. So I think that's probably a fair assessment. So what have we been up to in the college? Where are we going? And then let's get into some questions, the issues that are in your mind at the moment. We've done an awful lot. There's a lot of stuff has happened over the first 3 years. Still a huge amount left to do. And I know there have been references to demand over the last couple of days, and I'm not going to put the infographic thing up in front of you, because if you've ever heard me talk before, I nearly always put the demand infographic up. But it's a really good example of getting the knowledge sorted out, doing the proper analysis, every force in the country, what has changed in demand, what is really changing. You know the answer to that. The vulnerability issues becoming centre, the resources moving within policing towards issues of vulnerability, and the huge rise in online activity, online investigation, online intelligence, online and cybercrime. So I think that was a very good example of perhaps we could all feel what was happening, but it was right that we did the analysis and we can produce a clear picture. And then it becomes a neutral, honest, easy to read example of what the evidence base really is. We published the toolkit, so for all those decisions that many of you will be making with local authorities around which particular interventions might work in your local area. Does CCTV make any difference? Does taking a teenager into prison to get them scared straight? All those things. About 30 or 40 of those are now available to you on our easy to follow toolkit thing online, and I know many people in the room have been using that. On particular issues, we've gone further into the research. So domestic abuse is a good example where we've looked at what are the risk factors that we should all be thinking about in domestic abuse cases. In issues of mental health, we've looked to get below the crisis points that you and your officers and staff encounter every day and try and understand better what is really happening there. On organisational justice, some very good research over the last 3 years, which points, perhaps not surprisingly, that if people within an organisation feel the organisation is fair and listens to them and they are engaged, then the way they perform their role and the way they interact with the people we serve benefits from that too. So the whole continuum from how do you feel in your organisation, what climate do you operate in, what is the atmosphere that you enjoy or suffer on a daily basis, pertinent of course to you as very senior leaders working with the chief officer team, and pertinent to all the people who work with you, for many of whom you are of course the ceiling on their world and you are the creator of the atmosphere for good or not so good. And when I reflect back on that bit of research, I look at that piece of research which tells us perhaps something obvious, that if you feel well regarded and you're engaged and you're listened to, then you feel confident and happier at work. And I think back a few generations, I look at my great-grandfather joined in 1902. Be interesting to know what superintendents were like then, but the workload looked like it was stealing things and violence. And then my grandfather joined a bit later. By then cars had been invented and he was dealing with people stealing things and violence. And then I joined 1980 and I was generally dealing with people stealing things and violence. Oh, and by the way, personal radios had been invented and computers were on the agenda for a few years to come. If I look at people joining in the last couple of years and what they are dealing with, as you well know, the complexity has just risen to an extraordinary level. And they are dealing with far more complex decision-making, and they are taking in many more factors in carrying out their duties. So the leadership review, which is another piece of the evidence base, another piece of the knowledge area, the leadership review took that look into the future that Gavin pushes us to do, and it talked about the type of leaders we might need over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And it matched it with the change in demand and the change in society and the change in the economy, etc., changing technology, and talked about some of the changes we might need to make, and I'll come to that in a minute. So if that's the knowledge area, one of the other areas we are responsible for is education. We've rewritten the curriculum for people joining policing and many of the areas as people progress. We've changed the education programme in many of the high-risk areas that I was mentioning under knowledge. So, for example, domestic abuse, the programme there has been completely changed and piloted now in Humberside and in Hertfordshire. So please speak to colleagues from there and have a look at what that programme means. We've taken a very deep look at the education, training and learning in the whole covert and undercover world, and you'll understand why that was so important and how involved many of you will be as authorising officers and taking responsibility for some of those very high-risk roles. And now the education and training in that area is really very different and I think really very high quality. And within that education piece, perhaps the biggest thing we've looked at over the last 3 years is what are the educational requirements and qualifications and support we should give people within policing. We put it under the heading of Police Education Qualification Framework, and Jackie Alexander, I know, is very much, Jackie over here, is very much involved in the PEQF, if you can excuse me using that term, board, and has been representing your views. This is again about looking to the future, again about understanding how the nature of police work has changed over the years and saying, well, in that case, what level are people now working at and what type of support, recognition and qualification should they have over the next few years? And this does challenge the way we have operated in the past. It challenges the way people like me, without a degree, came into policing many years ago, and I suspect many people in the room as well. And we've been consulting on those proposals, and at the entry point into policing, they are beginning to mature into proposals that will go to our board for approval in not many weeks' time, around using a higher level apprenticeship for people coming into policing, so somebody joining policing and then completing a higher level apprenticeship to level 6 over the first 3 years that they serve in policing, being in the workplace plus taking 20% of the time to do learning, working with an education provider, or for people who have a degree, converting that into a police degree, or people completing a practical police degree in the way that you would see teachers, nurses, and other similar professionals coming in. A very practical police degree, perhaps 50% of the time working in a police force, 50% of the time doing the study. So they are the points of entry into the service that we are looking at. They're not decided yet, but these are the proposals that are being developed. For superintendents, the initial proposal was around requiring a level 7 or master's qualification before you could become a superintendent. And we've reflected on that, and we've listened to your feedback, and we consulted with you. It's interesting to look at the qualifications and development of superintendents, because superintending ranks, because you stand out amongst all the other ranks in policing where you are supported into your role. So if you're becoming a sergeant, you take part in a national programme of learning, you have to qualify, and then you become a sergeant. Same can be said for inspector, same can be said for chief officer. But somehow at superintending level, we haven't given the same support, we haven't tied it to a qualification, and we haven't given people that recognition. And it's quite feasible that in some forces, you're a chief inspector on the Friday, and you're a superintendent on the Monday because you passed a promotion process. For direct entry superintendents, we came up with a very good 18-month programme, and I'm grateful for the support that's come from the association in designing that programme and supporting people on the direct entry scheme. And I think some of them might be at the conference, so welcome to you if you are here. But one of the key lessons from that is the amount of care we've put in to developing those people and supporting them in becoming superintendents. And it strikes me that we haven't supported people moving into that role who are already in the service. So we've thought again about the police education qualification framework and how it affects people at your level. And the current proposal is now looking at when someone is in the superintending ranks, working with them and supporting them to qualify at level 7, and using the higher level apprenticeship, because a higher level apprenticeship means at that academic qualification level, master's level in this case. So working with a high level apprenticeship while you are in the rank to allow someone to qualify as a superintendent and achieve a master's degree over the first perhaps 2 years of being in rank as a superintendent. So that's a change from what we were talking about previously. That's as a result of listening to your feedback and working with Jackie and others, and we'll now examine how that proposal could operate, and perhaps you'll have questions on that in a minute. So we try and build what we do on the knowledge, and then the central plank is the education, the qualifications, the recognition and the support of people in policing. But we also have a responsibility for setting standards, and I know that consistency has been a big issue over the last couple of days here, and there were many questions, I know, in the session with Gavin and the Minister yesterday about consistency. There are some areas where it is clear we should have national standards, and if I go back to undercover and covert policing, I'm sure you would agree that we should all operate to clear national standards in those areas. And we've done good work there, I think, in publishing the APP for undercover and putting that in the public domain. I also think in the area of mental health, it's right that we've published authorised professional practice in that area, again, to make sure we have consistent standards and guidance throughout the country. And domestic abuse, I've already talked about building the knowledge base in that area and changing the education. Well, we've also set new standards in the area of domestic abuse, and we've published APP in that area in the last 12 months. One of the next areas we're looking at is using the work from the leadership review to publish leadership principles that we can all adhere to, and that, for example, the HMI can use. The question has been asked, what does good leadership look like? What are the principles we should be working to? And those leadership principles are being developed, and I know there'll be people in the room involved in that work at the moment. But perhaps at the sharp end of standards and consistency is something that Gavin was talking about yesterday and in his opening remarks at the conference. And that's the idea of a licence to practice or similar regime within policing. And we haven't had that in the way that other professions have had it, and that is now something we are taking a very serious look at. We have it in effect in some areas, in that you would never be able to do police using firearms, you wouldn't be able to carry out public order duties, a number of other things without being currently qualified in that area. And yet there are other things we do in policing that are high risk, where we don't have the same type of rules ensuring consistency across forces. So for me, a licence to practice would mean that that individual carrying out that role is properly qualified to do it. And we have to set out what properly qualified means and how you maintain your qualification. It would mean that somebody in that role maintains their continuing professional development, adheres to properly understood and followed CPD, as you would expect to see in other professions. And it would mean that someone in that role is registered with their professional body as being qualified in that area, and that they should only carry out that role if they are on the register with their professional body, which you would see in any other profession that carries out high-risk functions. And if we go back to your survey, particularly around public protection, we see that 82% of people overseeing public protection units at superintending rank said they were not qualified and hadn't had sufficient training in that role. Well, that seems disappointing at one end, possibly a shocking finding that we're putting people in such a high-risk role without the support, training and qualifications that they would need to succeed. So this is an area we're moving forward quickly at the moment, and it's one I'm very pleased to say where we seem to have a decent level of agreement. Gavin and the association are saying there are some very high-risk areas where we need better training, qualifications and standards. The college are saying there are some high-risk areas where consistency is very, very important, and we should be clear about the education qualifications, the CPD, and how you maintain your place on that register. And at the Home Office, the Minister and the Home Secretary have been supportive about the powers we are likely to need to be able to deliver a licence to practice of the type that I've been talking about. So we're currently working with Home Office officials, and I know there are some in the room today, to establish what legal authority would we need to maintain registers, and do we have sufficient powers, particularly around police staff with powers, to make sure that we could operate a licence to practice effectively in policing. So happy to take questions on how that work is coming forward at the moment, but I do feel encouraged that all the key parties within policing seem to be in agreement about taking that agenda forward. I'm going to stop for questions in a minute. For me, the whole purpose of having a professional body is to equip the people who work within it to be confident decision makers, genuine professionals, not someone whose work is constantly checked, not someone whose life is driven by performance and competing with others, but genuinely an autonomous professional who can make important high-risk decisions and is supported by qualifications and ongoing learning and the way the system operates to perform in that way. If a community midwife comes to your house to deliver a baby, it doesn't matter whether that community midwife is in Cumbria or Cambridge or Cornwall. They're qualified to the same level. They work from the same evidence base. They work from the same code of conduct, and they are trusted, serious professionals who maintain their own continuing professional development. We in policing perform a massively important task in every community in our country. And the individuals we have at the front end are not the people who joined 50, 100 years ago, dealing with what they dealt with. They are people dealing with highly complex decisions. I want to see us as a profession operating in that way, where we're clear about who's qualified to do what, where if it's high risk to the public and you as individuals, you're supported by a licence to practice, and there's recognition for the level that people are working at, and they're allowed to make those decisions, and they're supported in doing so. And I know you had Matthew Syed here in the last couple of days, and I think he's excellent. I'm glad he came back from Rio to talk to you. He stresses the importance of learning from everything that happens, whether it goes well and whether it goes badly. And I know there are lots of obstacles to learning because we are an arm of the state, and if something bad happens, there will quite rightly be an investigation to see whether there's been a transgression and to make sure the state has carried out its functions correctly. We can't duck that, but nor should we use it as an excuse for saying it's too hard to learn lessons because we get tied up in investigations or inquiries or whatever it might be. We've got to pick up what Matthew is saying and what others are saying. There's plenty of learning that we can take to allow us to move forward. So, much has been done in the last 3 years. Very grateful to the Superintendent Association for your involvement, particularly Gavin and Irene for the way they've helped shape your professional body. And there's a huge amount of work still to do. The membership system, which we've been testing in recent weeks, is nearly ready to go, and many of you have come on to Polka, and we now have about 70,000 people in policing on the online communities called Polka. And if you want to learn more about Polka or membership, behind the black screen over there is the College of Policing stand, and I know they'll be happy to show you how things are developing. So that's a run through of where we've been and some hints as to where we're going. Do you have any questions?
Right, hands up, ladies and gentlemen, for questions. You've got a gentleman over there. I'll get a mic to him in just a tick. But first of all, one off the app. The app is fully operational, so please use it now. First question I'm going to put to you off the app, if I may, Mr. Marshall. Superintendents already have a huge workload and an increasing span of command. Having to complete a master's degree or higher level apprenticeship will add pressure. The superintendent rank has shrunk by 27%. How will the college and forces balance out these demands while recognising the need to professionalise the organisation?
Yep. Well, first of all, I don't dispute the level that people are working at or the complexity, and that's one of the reasons I think when people finish in their careers, they should have the qualification and recognition that working at that level deserves. And by the way, there are many people in policing who already have academic qualifications. But for me, the level you're working at is level 7, it is master's level, and I think people in superintending ranks should be supported in achieving that master's level and having a recognised qualification. The practical issues that are raised in the question are about how much time can you do it, over what period should we allow people to do this study. We need to work that through with forces, as well as how do forces access the money from the high level apprenticeship scheme to support people who are going through that qualification.
I think what he's saying, or this person's saying, is it really practical given the climate you're in with a 27% reduction in their ranks? Is it physically possible?
Yes, it is possible. Other professions qualify to that level for people of this seniority carrying out those type of difficult roles.
OK, gentleman at the back, introduce yourself, tell us who you are.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Michael Mulqueen from Leicestershire. As I shared with colleagues yesterday, I entered the service through the direct entry scheme. Just a little bit of context, if I may, to support my question. Prior to joining the service, I was a university professor. And my role in that context, indeed my last job in that context, was to design an executive master's programme for police officers in the intelligence role. And I suppose my experience of that around designing that programme was very much one whereby we were able to, in line with the forces and in line with the officers who were undertaking the programme, design a programme around their workload needs. So, it was very much every couple of months, even we would do an intensive weekend of lectures, those kinds of things. We were able to design the programme around their needs. And of course, we were able to change regulations within the university such that people without degrees were able to go straight on, not just to a master's programme, but an executive master's programme. which helped. The thing we weren't able to square was the cost element, the personal cost element, and that's why I'm speaking up on this, because I would be concerned on behalf of colleagues that they would incur some significant personal debt. And I just wonder, in that context, we've heard over the last number of days about the Police Transformation Fund, whether under the guise of workforce transformation, the case can be made to support not just superintendents, but officers across the piece in pursuance of further education in a way that is adequately funded and avoids the personal indebtedness that it implies.
Michael, thank you very much. Firstly, on the eligibility, in my experience, when universities look at what you have done already in your careers, there should be sufficient prior learning to allow you to go straight onto a master's programme, because you've already done an awful lot and you can evidence it for those people who don't have a first degree, such as me. In terms of the cost, I mentioned the higher level apprenticeship scheme. We haven't got time to do it in great detail, but basically every organisation in the country, not just policing, is putting money into a levy and can only get that money back if they operate apprenticeship schemes. One form of the apprenticeship scheme in policing will be people joining and going to level 6 over the first 3 years in their careers. But another use of that scheme, and therefore that levy, we propose should be to support superintendents. And an interesting development in recent weeks from the government is, even if you've used up all your levy money, if you still want to put people through the higher level apprenticeship and support them in that qualification, the government will refund up to 90% of those costs. So we think there's a very good conversation to have with employers over the next few months, the chief constables, police and crime commissioners across the country, to see their approach to how they want to access their levy. And important to say, the higher level apprenticeship scheme can only have one scheme per profession, as it were, so you can't have a high level apprenticeship joining scheme in one force that's different to another. It has to be one approved national high level apprenticeship scheme. So it's a bit technical and detailed, but there's some good news, I think, in terms of the way the funding has been put together, and the Transformation Fund is another route we're looking at should there be a shortfall. We can't answer those questions until we can make the firm proposal.
Another one off the app, and if there's anyone with a burning question in the audience, please make yourself known to one of our microphone holders right now. This one off the app says, when will College of Policing come up with a national and common working definition of vulnerability requiring police intervention? It's something the Police Minister touched on yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these questions about when is this going to happen?
Okay, and for those of you, particularly in the public protection world, you might know that we're running a seminar on public protection, I think it's next week or the week after, where Dave Tucker, who leads that work in the college, will be there, and we'll have the latest position on the research around vulnerability. We are working towards a common definition. By the way, this is a global problem, and I've looked at Scandinavian, Australian and American definitions, and some of them refer back to what we are currently doing in the UK to seek a definition. So it's a common problem. We are working on it. I don't have an end date for you, but for those of you at the PPU conference next week, a good one to talk to Dave Tucker about.
And another when question. When will College provide an accredited course for public protection senior managers and licensed qualified professionals to work and lead in these areas? Again,
okay, we are making those proposals now. We've written to the Home Office seeking the powers we would need to do it. We've had a positive response from the Home Office, and we are now needing to get into the detail of what would be put in legislation to allow us to maintain that register and therefore operate a licence to practice. So I think the legislation would be in the next year or so. I'm looking for Home Office officials to give me a nod. Could be further out than that, I don't know. But regardless of that, we are now working on the licence to practice proposals, and they will develop over the next few weeks.
It'll have to be our last question, otherwise we're going to be seriously overrunning. But introduce yourself, sir. And
good morning, Alex. Chris Harden from West Yorkshire Police. You've talked about the greater complexity that officers are dealing with now compared to the stealing things and violence that most of us dealt with when we joined. So is it time to finally put to bed the myth of the omnicompetent police officer?
I think at the front end of policing, one of the great beauties and attractions of the role is you can come across anything, any moment, anywhere. So you can't remove the fact that the patrolling constable can encounter a car crash followed by a domestic abuse crime, followed by a missing person, followed by a mental health crisis. You can't remove that. What we shouldn't pretend is that particularly for people overseeing specialist areas, you can just do anything without qualification. That feels unacceptable, and by the way, we're lopsided already because you can't command a firearms operation unless you are properly qualified to do it, and yet you can oversee complex child abuse investigations with a complete inconsistency on the way people are prepared and qualified. So I think at the front end on the street, one of the great things about policing is the variety of work and the fact you need to have so many different skills and it's so complex, but we must take seriously giving people the support and qualification they need to do a high-risk role. It protects the public and it protects the individual.
And Nick, one more off the app, if I may, and then we'll let you go, Mr. Marshall. With regards to entry point qualifications and completion of degree courses, has nothing been learned from the negative impact these measures have had on service delivery within the NHS? Where is the evidence base for this?
That's an interesting one. So I quite often hear that as a result of higher education qualifications, nursing has deteriorated, and you hear that people are too posh to wash, or whatever the term might be. So I did look at the evidence in this area, and the only evidence I can find is that where you have wards with the higher qualified nurses to a degree level, you have better mortality rates than on wards that don't have that level of qualification. I can find no evidence at all to support that popular claim. There could well be something, and look at the Francis report for what happened in Staffordshire. There are all sorts of issues in our own profession and in other professions where things have gone badly wrong, and there's an argument to be said about people's ability to care and show empathy, and you hear that in policing, of course, as well. Are we still good communicators? Can we show empathy? Do we have emotional intelligence? I can see no link between that and whether or not someone has a degree.
Mr. Marshall, thank you very much indeed. Show your appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you.